All right, greetings all. Raphael X here with Jeremy. Please click on the like button to subscribe. Right, leave a notification and also share this video. All right, so for the topic of today, we will be discussing freedom and the will and see where that takes us. Right, doing a historical run, philosophical run throughout history and talking about this subject. Very important, one of the top philosophical subjects. And here's my friend Jeremy, who will be with me today discussing this topic. Hello, Jeremy. Say hello to everyone. Everyone sees you, of course. All right. So the philosophy of freedom. What is essentially freedom? What do we mean by freedom? How do we understand freedom? And why is it in a topic of importance today? What are the ancient? How did the ancients see freedom? How did the medieval see freedom? And then we have modern philosophy, and then contemporary today. What is our view of freedom today? Right, the prevailing view, we can say, the overarching view in society. All right, well, Jeremy, if you want to chime in here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so freedom of the will, big topic, and I think that it could be both theoretically interesting and practically interesting. The philosophy that we hold has practical consequences inevitably for our life. If we come to the conclusion that we are not free, that's one way to live life, or one way of life follows. And if we come to the conclusion that we are free, then something wholly different may in turn follow. So I think we can begin by trying to define the terms, right? Because if we don't really clarify what is meant by freedom, what is meant by will, we're just probably going to be going in circles, right? So do you want to give a crack at defining some of these terms?
Yeah, sure. Well, freedom. Yeah, well, I mean, basically, well, freedom has different aspects to it, of course, or different, we can say, divisions. But basically, it comes down to two, in a very basic sense: freedom of the negative view of freedom, like a freedom from, where you have no type of imposition. You maintain your agency, right? There's a very, we can say, superficial notion of freedom that everyone understands, right? It's necessary, right? And then we have a more profound freedom, freedom for, like freedom that involves obligations, right? Freedom that is limited, freedom within the moral realm, freedom for the good, essentially, which is we see today is kind of denied. But yeah, basic in a very basic sense, those two. I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, so I think a classical way to frame the issue in light of what you mentioned is that we're clearly free to do what we want. I want to have a snack, and insofar as there's no, say, handcuffs on me, there's no external issues with me having a snack. I'm free to have a snack. I want to drive to the mall. Well, if I have gas in the car and I'm able to so do, I'm free to drive to the mall. But the problem begins when we ask, are we free to desire as we wish? That I can do as I want is one thing, but can I want as I want? And if not, then it seems to make a mockery of any freedom. If I have no say as to the desires that come about, right? I have a desire out of nowhere, and then I may or may not be free to follow it depending on the circumstances, right? I may have a desire to jump to the moon. Okay, I can't do that. I have a desire to scratch my nose. Okay, I can do that, but that doesn't seem to be real freedom, right? I'm a slave to the compulsions that arise. So I think if I just briefly continue, one major objection to any possibility of freedom that has been brought up many times, especially in modern times, is trying to conceive of freedom under the umbrella of mechanical causation, right? As kind of had substantial showing in fields such as physics. So I think that would be the first thing to try to really tackle if we want to proceed any further, because right away, the empirically minded scholar or individual is liable to say, I know there's no freedom because everything is caused, right? Cause and effect. Ultimately, a person is synonymous with or an epiphenomenon of the neurons in the brain, which are physical, which is a physical substance, right? And therefore, of course, there cannot be any freedom of will. What does it mean, right? And if we say something is by chance, that's also not freedom. Right? The ancient philosopher Epicurus, the philosopher of pleasure, he wanted to free individuals from fear of superstition and such. So he said, "There's only atoms, atoms in the void," as it was later put. Right, and yet he wanted to preserve some semblance of freedom, some little bit of freedom, because that also wouldn't be too fun if there's no freedom. So he said occasionally the atoms swerve a little bit, and that's what gives us freedom. Right, and now we have also in contemporary times the notion of physical determinism, right? In the style of the 17th, maybe the 18th century of Laplace. You know, if I knew every position of the atom, I would have a complete picture of the entire universe. And then it has been said, well, quote unquote, quantum uncertainty can lead to freedom because it would lead to some probability or chance. But that's absurd, first of all. And if for no other reason than that chance would not be freedom either. So it seems we're in between a rock and a hard place initially. Either the effect follows the cause, in which case we're not free, or there is some kind of probability, perhaps because of quantum uncertainty, quote unquote, or whatnot, but that also wouldn't be freedom. That's just chance.
Right. It's really interesting you say that, because definitely with the first philosophers looking for kind of the primary principle of all things, they were looking in matter. So this is the problem that's ultimately led up with for the atomists or atomists, ultimately saying that, yeah, that it is matter that is the primary stuff of all beings. So the thing is, if all things are matter, you cannot but be a determinist, right? Because everything, as you alluded to, would be run by scientific laws. So you would just be determined. So freedom is incompatible with materialism. And this is definitely a dilemma. This is a dilemma philosophically. The thing is, freedom is something that is immediately self-evident that we experience. But how do we explain it? It would have to have an immaterial principle. Right? This is the only explanation. It cannot have a material principle because, again, as you alluded to, matter is deterministic, determined by scientific laws. But and we see this by its effects, because man is unpredictable, right? The animals you can predict in a certain sense, right? They have certain characteristics of behaviors, but man is a microcosmos. He is totally unpredictable, and this shows that he has the principle of freedom. But again, it has to be based on an immaterial principle, and that is one of the proofs. Maybe not such a clear-cut proof, but one of the proofs, or we can say something that points to the existence of the soul, the principle of life, right? So the scholastics at least would say that, and really based on Aristotle, that really the soul would have to be the basis and the only justification for one to believe in freedom. So again, scientifically, and this is the whole problem with the quantum mechanics, because now they're getting into the metaphysical realm, and they are getting away from this whole mechanistic determinism. So with the whole quantum mechanics talking about conscientious observation. I don't want to get into quantum philosophy, but that is really something interesting. That conscientious observation is something that almost it causes, in a sense, subatomic reality. Again, I don't want to get into that, but this notion of freedom is coming into science, which many scientists, right, I should say scientists from scientism, they believed it to be some freedom's a philosophical topic, not a scientific topic. But now we're seeing freedom is being incorporated into sciences. This is making scientists very much uncomfortable. So just wanted to add that. I don't know if you want to.
No, that's a great point, Doc. Yeah, I think we can also try to directly address this notion of mechanical causation. All right, so the philosopher Hume made an excellent point that in considering phenomenal content, and by phenomenal we don't mean great, we mean sense-connected content. The sole notion that we can derive is that of succession. One billiard ball strikes another billiard ball, and the second billiard ball moves. We take a rock and we drop it and it falls. That's one thing. And yet from our inner life, we can establish a unique relationship between, for example, a desire and that which follows it. And it can be offered that the notion of causation is derived strictly and purely from our inner life, from our inner experience, the necessity of, if I want something more than I don't want it, to try to pursue that. And then it's applied unthinkingly and perhaps unwittingly to the outer world in a naive way. We take what is really succession, one thing follows another thing, and then we apply causation as derived from our inner life again onto that. And we say that there's mechanical necessity and causation as it concerns the empirical world. And then we try to throw it back on our inner life and say, and therefore that binds our inner life. All right, so it's a little kind of if you get what I'm saying,
Right,
it's
right.
unintentional, unwitting little error here of reasoning that we do. Now, as it concerns the entire realm of physics, I think a salient point is that the only thing that can be done in that domain, as it concerns that endeavor, is to try to quote unquote save the appearances. We have certain experiences, and then we try to account for them in more and more systematic and convenient ways. We can make observations. We can mathematicize those observations, represent them mathematically. Then we can try to derive conclusions from some of those equations, for example, differential equations or otherwise. And we can try to, through correspondence statements of saying which formula means what in our experience, we can try to consider whether or not our experience supports the system that has been come up with. Then that can be again, we see the philosophy of Aristotle, the animus or whatever it was, that took such a firm hold of Europe for a very long time, right? Where only Aristotle can be right. There's no way anybody, nothing else is possible. And of course, you can have a Newton come along, you can have an Einstein come along, but these are all ways to save the appearances, to ascribe absolute literalism and reality to some of these words, to some of these equations is, again, it's not even wrong. It's just, it's ridiculous. All right. So we say that we start from, on the contrary, what we can do is start from the direct brute facts of experience, of reality as we understand it to be. For example, causation as experience in inner life. And as for how the empirical world affects that's a separate matter. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's for sure. On your point of Aristotle being, there was kind of a pushback on him with the whole scientific revolution, and that's what we're seeing kind of the basis of the denial of freedom with the scientific revolution, run amok, I should say. But really, that's interesting. Yeah, Aristotle, even Galileo was debating about certain things regarding to astronomy. He was debating Aristotelian, so and he was actually making fun of him.
Refused to look through the telescope, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So it's interesting. In that scientific revolution, we're seeing mathematics replace metaphysics. So mathematics becomes absolutized, and it is that's really the basis of this mechanistic view of reality. But it's interesting because what you also kind of allude to is that kind of a pushback. I mean, what you imply it, but I see it in a much more radical sense that we have throughout modern philosophy, because of the absolutization of science and math, freedom has been obscured, and because people have seen that as kind of a dry type of mentality, there's been a pushback, but a radical pushback of existentialism, which existentialism, and this has to do with epistemology also, because it's a radical notion of freedom. Existentialism, now, there is existentialism of Kierkegaard, which is a Christian existentialism, but what I'm referring to the radical existentialism of Sartre, or Sartre, as they would say in French. So his existentialism is radical, that man is freedom. Like it's not something you have, but it's something that you are defined by. So this would be a radical response to determinism. Again, the other extreme. So because we're emotional creatures, we always, we respond to one extreme with another extreme. So we have this radical existentialism, which defines man as freedom, and to the point where man does not have a fixed nature, to the point where man is a radical interpretation also of modern philosophy of Descartes, at least, where man even defines reality, right? The extramental reality. Extramental, that's how we define reality. What is real? What is extramental? But that is not, they wouldn't say extramental, obviously. It would be intramental. So it's really man who is so free that in his freedom he has no limits. There's an absolute freedom in a sense. So I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, Professor. So I think we should try to proceed step by step and see as to whether or not freedom is absolute. I think an argument can be made that, well, we don't want to jump too far ahead.
Right.
I think a moderate position can be taken as to the relativity or absoluteness of freedom. I think a further kind of good thing based on the demand of the times is to clarify precisely and exactly what is meant, right? Because otherwise it remains a sterile abstraction, or is liable to remain such an abstraction. Meaning, if I just hear, man is freedom, okay, what do I do with that? Right? And it's nothing to do with what you said, what these philosophers have said, right? What does that mean? How am I free? So on the contrary, when we take an approach of something perhaps like critical philosophical analysis or interpretation of experience, as opposed to just some or another realism, right, or playing with words, the neurons, the chemicals, this or that. I think when we clarify exactly what is meant, then we're like, well, this is true. And then it can really enter into our life, right? Things that are really real to me, my bank account, my stomach, my digestive system, my bed. These things are real to me because they're concrete. I know what they are. I know how they reflect on my interests. Different abstractions, happiness, eternity, freedom, they're not real to me because I don't know exactly what is meant. So we want to try to get as real as we can. All right. So trying to proceed then down that path. I think so. We say, going back to the notion of causation as drawn from our inner life, that it can refer, the word cause can refer to an inner observation concerning the dynamics of desires. When I want something more than I don't want it, I must seek such satisfaction unless persuaded not to by myself or others. For example, if I only want the drink of water and nothing else, I have to take the drink of water. So it is a misuse of the word free to say, but I'm free not to. And this is where people may get tripped up, right? Is saying, oh, freedom means I can do whatever I want, just like that. We would say, no, I'm not free if I only want this and nothing else. I'm not free to not to do. A mother who only loves her child and wishes to take care of the child is not free to abandon that child, goodness forbid. All right. For example, we can establish that by some practical examples now. So, Professor, are you free to touch your nose right now?
Yes, of course.
Can you demonstrate?
Yes. There you go.
So am I. Right. Are you free, however, right now to go jog around the block?
Yes, but I won't
Go do
demonstrate
it. Go do it. So I would say you're not free, right? This is a misconception. We confuse imagination with real desire. In order to be able to do something, I have to want it. So you would be free to run around the block if you wanted to. But if you don't want to, you're not free, right? And there's the limit to what you're able to want. So if I offered you $100, for example, maybe then you would be free. If 100 is not enough, you know how wealthy guys like us are, right? Then maybe 1,000 would do the trick, 2,000, but a certain price, okay, I'll do it. But without a sufficient counter motive to the self-nullification that something that would accompany something, I can't do it, right? Somebody comes up to you and says, give me $1. I really need it for gas. Unless you're a very big miser, right? Or you have some other idea, maybe this is somebody involved with substances, this and that. You're free to give it to them, right?
Right.
And you can do it. What if somebody comes up to you and says, "Give me your arm for lunch"? Are you free to say yes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not really. No, in a sense, no. Yeah.
Not completely not. It's as impossible as anything else, unless already very cuckoo and ready
Right.
to do it anyway
Right.
or something. If I can't, I can
Right.
only do that which I desire. All right.
Right.
So
Right.
and so that's the necessity from which we derive, it seems, the notion of cause. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we then take this causation, this necessity, and we apply it to succession in the outer world. One billiard ball hits the other billiard ball. And then we say the outer world is bound by necessity, right? And that must apply to me. So we're kind of inverting things here and mixing things up. So we say, no, whatever be the deal with causation or succession as it applies to the external world, real causation and necessity applies to the inner world. So now the riddle becomes to try to figure out something to mean by the term freedom, some aspect of inner life or some function that we can ourselves supervise or infer the existence of, that sort of necessity that we just described does not apply to it.
Yeah. That's okay. It's very interesting what you're saying, and complex in a way. The object of the will is the good. So metaphysically, you cannot desire what you do not perceive as good. So you cannot desire means you perceive something as good, right? As the even the sense appetite, we can say, of love, for example. In a very basic sense, you cannot desire the hamburger if you do not see the hamburger as a good, right? So and with the will, you have the intellectual appetite. So these goods are more, they're intellectual goods, immaterial goods. So, and that's why they say the will is kind of a blind appetite and needs to be fed off the intellect. So the thing is, that apprehension of as you see something as good is automatic on the sense level. On the sense level, your body desires food, right? Let's say you desire food. So seeing so a certain food that you like, the desire comes, right? It automatically proceeds from that, we can say, that desire proceeds from the sense experience, and then the willing comes. So really, and this is interesting too, because with the sense appetites, we can be trained, right? We can be trained also. We can, because pleasure and pain. So for example, if I'm going to do a sport and I'm training and it's painful, I'm not wanting the pain for itself, right? That's not the object of the will, the pain for itself, but I'm almost getting that, doing that pain, going through that pain for the sake of another good. But it is true but does this good, do certain goods, and this is an interesting question, does it determine us? That's the question. What would be the cause of that? And that's very interesting. So on the sense appetite, there is not much freedom in that profound aspect. When I'm hungry, I have to eat, right? So I have the freedom to eat or not eat? Well, yes, and this is really interesting. The will can reject what is perceived as good. This is really interesting. For the sake of another thing that's perceived as good. Like, so for example, if I don't eat, I want to starve myself, like I'm anorexic, for example. I'm seeing that because I want to get my body in a certain shape, that as a higher good than eating. But it is impossible, metaphysically speaking, that the will pursue something that it does not see as a good, even if it's really evil, or even if it's really evil. And this is what sin does. That's why people sin, because they're looking for a good within that sin, like adultery, for example. Why do people commit adultery? Because they're looking for the good of the pleasure, and most of the times it's pleasure. The good of pleasure, and pleasure is a good, but in a disordered fashion within that, right? The whole act of adultery, which would make it, right, sinful, make it bad. So in that sense, what is desire? So we have to define what's desirable. That is something that we perceive as good.
Yeah, no, those are excellent points, Professor, and let's try to kind of work all of that into our vision of freedom. The necessity of pursuing that which we take to be good, and all of that. So, but first, let's try to tackle this question. So, what is freedom then? Right? What is freedom? We said that what is not freedom? Necessity and causation. I want something. More than I don't want it, I must seek it. Is there something within me that is not bound by those same rules? And if we try here, we see if we can get tripped up by retaining in our repertoire, however you pronounce it, these different terms: will, freedom, intelligence. There's another word, however, that we can use to simplify the matter. And I think that word refers to that which is the best candidate for what is really, truly free. And that word is intelligence, or the intellect.
Right.
How do we prove this? We need to now establish that the intelligence functions in a way that is truly free, i.e., in a way that is not bound by the same logical necessities that were mentioned before as it concerns desire. I want something more than I don't want it. I necessarily must pursue it. Is the intelligence bound by these same rules or not? So here's some arguments, and you tell me what you think of them.
I think the freedom is, so the object of the intellect is truth, and the object of the will is good. And so this presupposes that there exists what is true, there exists what is good. So we need to presuppose at least a basic metaphysical realism that things exist, right? That truth exists, that I can conform myself with reality, and I can desire what is actually good for me in one way or another. I can pursue the good exists, and I can pursue it. So only thus can freedom truly rest. So freedom cannot, because I mean that is the very nature of the object of each thing. So we are by nature, we have this built-in, this mechanism built, or I should say this natural tendency to know the truth, this natural tendency to know the good. And only fulfilling this natural function are we truly free. Now I'm going to the kind of Aquinas and Aristotelian medieval view, but I'm as a Catholic, I think this is the most true and the best explanation. That really freedom has to be within the parameter of truth. Without truth, we fall into a slavery. And the thing is, because this is what is ordered essentially. Freedom comes from the interior principle and not from what is, falsely thought of as, exterior principles. Yes, freedom is necessary. The exterior principles, there can't be, binding circumstances that make me do certain thing, but it's the interior principle, and it has to come from the order. Me pursuing the object of the intellect, which is truth, and me pursuing the object of the will, which is good. The object of the will, which is good. So the interesting is the will as a blind potency has to feed off the intellect, right? So the will cannot decide what's good without knowing. So the intellect animates the will. The will, again, is kind of blind in that sense. So it feeds off the intellect. What is really interesting is that the will can go against the intellect and say, even though I know this to be true, and I know this is good for that reason, I go against it and I do not choose that. But still, metaphysically speaking, it's because you've seen a good.
You're pursuing good.
But let me just say this, because this is a problem, because this is the Socratic notion of sin, we can say, that he says, sin is just ignorance then. No. There does exist depraved wills. And this is a mystery. This is a mystery. Like in theology, they say, why did Satan, Satan, there is certain sin. In our sins, there is certain ignorance to the sin, yes. But Satan, for example, he had absolutely no ignorance of the consequences of the sin, what was going to happen. He had diffused knowledge, but he still rebelled against God. I remember asking a theology teacher of mine, why did he do that? And his answer was because he wanted to. And that's the only answer that there is. It makes no sense. So really, that is the most sufficient answer, because we are microcosmos of our own. And I would say even society, they treat each individual persons as moral agencies, right? We send the criminals to jail. right? By default, you're responsible for your actions. Now, how do we explain that as a principal cause? It cannot be explained outside of the existence of a soul, I would say. But maybe I'm going into other topics. But
yeah, no, those are all great points. And yeah, we want to try to get to all of that, including the nature of what we call sin. It is sin, in fact, simply a mistake as to the good, as Socrates alleged. It's an intellectual error, right? It's like I wanted to get to the store, but I forgot to fuel up. Is all sin and all transgression like that, or is there a different version of it? So we should get to that. Right. Briefly speaking of the notion that the will and the intelligence are separate, I think there's some problems with that view. Right? So, German philosopher Schopenhauer posited that the in itself of the human being is a blind will. I think that it's guided by the antenna of intelligence, but that would seem to demand that the will has its own little intelligence, its own mini mind, to understand the determinations of the main mind, right? Because sometimes we know for a fact that we engage our main mind to think about the options. So then do we kind of convey that to the little micro mind of the will? So that's an argument to suppose that there's a unity between what we are liable to call will and what we're liable to call intelligence. And that opens the door for us to try to prove or to establish logically, again, the freedom of intelligence, that it is not bound by the same necessity and causation as was mentioned before. I want something more than I don't want it, I have to do it. So here's an argument for that, right? We see sometimes that we need to determine the appeal of something in order to act. Right? It's a nice Saturday, Sunday, and I'm thinking about what to do. Do I want to go to the mall? Do I want to go to the park? Do I want to go to the beach? What do I want to do? Do I want to stay at home? I don't know right away. And before I know, I cannot act. Right? So it may take me some time to contemplate and think, how appealing do I find the shopping trip? How appealing do I find the beach? Right? Do I have enough money? This, that. So now I'm using a capacity. Let's call it intelligence. We could call it X. I'm using a capacity to try to judge the appeal of these propositions that I have at hand. Now, the employment of that capacity, and I cannot act until I find out what is more appealing. I'm in a limbo, right? What do you want to do? I don't know, mall, beach. I don't know. Let me decide. I'm in a limbo. Now, if the employment of that capacity demanded that I first find it more appealing, then it seems we're stuck in an infinite regress. Because then in order to determine whether or not it is sufficiently appealing to employ intelligence, I need to first determine whether it is sufficiently appealing to determine whether it is sufficiently appealing to employ intelligence, and so forth and so on. In an infinite regress, I can never act. Mm-hmm. I can never make a determination or what's called a choice. That seems to say or show that intelligence is not bound by necessity and causation in the same way as are decisive determinations. Another technical way to think about it, I think, is perception. And perception has often been thought of as passive. There's some very strange theories in ancient times that there's a fire burning in the eye, whatever it might be, that reflects, who knows. But we say modern day psychologists would probably concur that perception is not passive. It's an active intellectual process. And yet in order to perceive, I'm sitting on the corner and I'm watching cars pass, people pass. Do I need a quote unquote cause or motive in order to perceive? No, I'm able to just perceive. Right? So we say that we can be tripped up by saying that in order to act, I need a motive. Right? And therefore that binds the will, supposing that the will is one thing, the intelligence is another thing. We say, or we offer for consideration, that there's a unity, such that is called intelligence, such that can be called intelligence, such that can be called will, or it can be simply called myself. And this unity in its pure function and its pure activity does not demand a motive for its function. If we say it demands a motive, we go in that infinite regress. How would I begin to consider the appeal of something if first I need a motive? Right? And on we go. Right? At first, I need to make a judgment as to what I like more. Well, what about to make that judgment? Do I also need to like that more than to not make that judgment? And so forth and so on. So we have this basic activity at the bottom of ourself, right? Freedom, right? That we can call freedom, or we can call will when it's applied, or again, that we can call simply ourself. Right? And as for, we can also add sentience. We can throw that into the mix because we say that obviously sentience affects our function. Right? I have to be cognizant of something in order for to make a decision about it. So we're going to say, okay, here's intelligence, here's sentience, here's will, and somehow the will has its own little mind, and the sentience has its own little intelligence. There's a unity, which we can call self, the sides of which can be referred to with terms such as sentience, such as will, such as intelligence. So that's the position kind of that I think we can put forth.
Right. It's not, I mean, it's not, at least in medieval, because my specialty is more in the modern philosophy. Is fascinating though. But my specialty is more in the scholastic kind of medieval philosophy, but I think it's very much harmonious with what you're saying. It's not a breaking up of the person with these different aspects or these different faculties, but really, yeah, they are unified in the person. It's really through their effects we're able to point out to the cause. So because intellection, we just point to intellect, desiring, we point to a will, sensual. So the sensual appetites or the intellectual appetite. So really, the intellect and the will are one. That cliche, which you can use here, two sides of the same coin, we can say applies here. So in that sense, yeah, they are. It's not a breaking up of them. So that's really interesting. But so going back to sin, though, in a sense, how would sin be defined? Now we could do another because we're kind of running out of time, and we could pick it up with this. But maybe if we could end on this note of sin, of doing wrong, morally wrong. If people don't like that, theological terminology of doing morally wrong. And isn't it true also that morality ties into this notion of freedom, that we have to, if we're going to be moral beings, we have to affirm the reality of freedom, because without freedom, again, if determinism is true, and we showed arguments for it not to be true, that freedom does exist. But if determinism is true, which has its own arguments, then really we're not moral beings. We're not responsible. We're not culpable, or we cannot merit. So if we can just end off on this note, kind of talking about the morally wrong, and how would that what do you think on that?
Yeah,
we define what's wrong.
Yeah, so I think ideally, would keep kind of going step by step. But yeah, we can kind of jump to that. So, insofar as
if you want to take it slower, you can. If you want to take it,
Yeah, well, we can offer kind of some ideas there, and then perhaps at a later time go back to something else. So, if we do grant that the intelligence is free, the intelligence then has two major capacities. One, it seems to be something we can call creaturely clarifications. What will satisfy me the most as creature? Will it be to scratch my nose or pick my nose? Will it be to eat the chocolate or the vanilla ice cream? The only question I ask is, what will satisfy me, qua creature, right? As an animal, as a creature, as a critter. I form into a given psychology, into a given physiology, a given psychophysiology, with all the claims thereof. I want to be treated well. I want to be treated poorly. I want to control. I want to be controlled. I want honor. I want respect. I want pride. I want this and that, right? I want pleasure, this kind of pleasure, that kind of pleasure. So one function of the intelligence is to determine what will satisfy me the most in the capacity of creature. Now, while I solely and exclusively use my intelligence in this way, I am stuck within the 4 cubits of my psychophysiological self, within my psychology, within my physiology. My goal as a human being is to go through that, to attain to self-consciousness, to attain to a vision or a communion with, we might say, the true, the good, the beautiful, to use a common kind of trio of phrases. And I would also do that with intelligence. However, applied as it concerns the consideration of truth for its own sake, albeit truth such that demands some self-sacrifice. We say that an individual is able to pursue truth in some particular arena without any issue. How far is Polaris, the star? How do the tectonic plates move? What is 2 + 2? All day. Also in business, how do I make this sell? But the moment some or another proposition of truth is presented such that infringes on self-will, such that calls for self-sacrifice, the very same person may flee like crazy. I've spent all my life studying psychology about you and you and you, right? How bad or good other people are. But if you turn it to me, I'm liable to break down in an instant. So the argument would be that I have some range, slight as it is, of freedom to contemplate truth as it concerns its own self, not how it relates back to me. I think there's three, at least, that come to mind, major opportunities for such employment. One is when we are faced with a conflict between a call of conscience and the claim of creaturehood. It's been suggested that conscience is not an acquisition later in life. It's an original part of the human being. We have a sense of truth initially that takes effort to destroy, but that is there at present. So when we have a call of conscience, I stole this cookie. I want this cookie, but it's not mine. And I have to decide now before we would say, oh, but you have to do what you want to do. But first of all, I have to attribute weight to the different propositions. And I attribute weight using my intelligence, which we say is free. We're arguing it's free. So freely, I attribute weight to the proposition, I want this cookie, to the proposition, this cookie is not mine. Now, once I've done that, I'm bound to do what I want to do more. Once I have said, it doesn't matter so much to me that this cookie is not mine, I'll take it anyway. I have to do it. As we said before, we're not free. I necessarily must do it. That is why my own hand may necessarily take my own life. My own hand may necessarily strike those closest to me. Because once the determination is made, once something is more appealing than not, it follows that it shall be done, or I shall try to do it. But I'm the one that grants appeal. So that's one opportunity. Another opportunity that we have is whenever something true is pointed out about ourselves, right? For example, a strong, say, sermon, a strong moral message, the necessity of overcoming selfishness and self-seeking. I'm also free within some range to interface with truth. And I can do so more or less sincerely. I can open up my heart a little bit more or a little bit less to truth.
Yeah.
Right?
No, what you're saying is totally, because we only have a couple of minutes. So just to respond to what you're saying, and what you're saying is very interesting, because we do need an intellectual justification of what we do. So even when we know what we're doing is wrong, you alluded to, without saying the word, a rationalization of it. So there has to be this kind of this intellectual justification, and it's really interesting. It shows how we are creatures, essentially defined by reason, the traditional rational animal, right, by Boethius definition of man, that we ultimately you cannot leave the schizophrenia for a long time. Yeah, so we only have like a couple of minutes. I did want to just wrap it up. We will continue again. I don't know if you want to say anything closing. We have like 2-3 minutes, but if you want to close off, Jeremy, the philosopher here.
So I'll just wrap up, right, with what we were saying, and good points as well, Professor, that basically we employ ourselves freely as it concerns our interface with truth, and that molds our character throughout our life. And what issues from our character does issue from it more or less by necessity. Once I have degenerated myself into a degenerate, into a degraded individual, of course, it's going to follow that degenerate and degraded acts issue from my character. But I had some influx, some contribution of freedom of myself in the capacity of freedom intelligence to my character. I responded to the third point that we didn't get to, right? It's how I respond to truth. It's how whenever there's a conflict between truth and my desires, and also how the attitude I form towards the feeling that there is something over and above myself, which forms the seed of the self-idolatry that later on will crystallize. The degree of self-idolatry, and obviously, if I have settled on an absolute degree of self-idolatry, that will eventually lead to an utter destruction and degradation of my character, no matter what.
Very, very nice to end off on that. How what we do essentially defines what we are doing and being, that intimate relationship which cannot be broken up, that you do morally make yourself up. And if you have a pattern of behavior, that's what you are. I mean, you can justifiably judge someone by their actions if there's a pattern of actions, of course. So if a murderer is one who murders, so really that self being, the what you are morally, stems from this pattern of acts, and that's really interesting because I
Yeah,
mean, see, at least in Catholic morality, this break between what you are and what you do, and that's a schizophrenia, philosophically speaking.
yeah.
But
Okay,
very
a minute
interesting.
left or so, or we're about to be cut off.
Yeah, we're about to be cut off. So we'll end it off at there. This is Dr. Rafael Gonzalez, the theologian. I'm more in theology, and my friend Jeremy, the philosopher. I hope he likes the title. And we'll leave it at that. Please stay tuned for the next show here. And God bless you all. Take care now.